Hey, what's up? This is Dara Hoffman Fox. I'm a queer identified mental health counselor and gender therapist and a transgender rights advocate. This is part 2 of a series that I am working on. This is having to do with transitioning later in life. I noticed in a lot of the comments from part 1 that there were people who watched the video and they were able to relate to it, and they were, let's say, maybe in their 30s or 40s. In this video in which I shared in part 1, I was talking about people who had written to me who were in their 60s. And it's kind of cool that it turns out that later in life can mean even somebody not transitioning until they're in their 30s or 40s. Makes total sense, because even if you're in their 30s, you still have made a lot of choices and decisions in your life, potentially based on a sense of your gender identity that is inaccurate. And so I could definitely see how this series could be helpful for people of multitude of ages. So once again, I'm glad you have found this one. Part 2, this is going to be a little bit of a dicey subject for me to talk about, but it's important that it's talked about, and it has to do with passing. The reason I say it's going to be dicey is because the word passing and the meaning of passing is something that is controversial. It's something that is difficult to talk about because in a lot of ways, the reason people have to be concerned about whether or not they quote-unquote pass as the gender identity that they hope people are seeing them as, one of the big reasons has to do with safety. And that is because our society still, there are still potential risks for people who are transgender. And that's why this isn't an easy subject to talk about, because then we also have to talk about, what does passing even mean? Who's to say whether or not someone passes or not? What are these rules about, in this case, it would be male and female. Who says who fits into those categories, let alone even mentioning people who are non-binary and what that means for them? Honestly, those are very important subjects to talk about when it has to do with passing, but I'm not going to be talking about that here. I just wanted you to know that it's on my mind. I know that this whole subject is very tricky to talk about, but I'm going to be specific and talk about the concern that people who are transitioning later in life have about passing, and I'm only going to focus on that in this video. The reason that I'm going to be discussing passing as a concern that people have who are thinking about transitioning later in life is because I have heard this come up with almost every client I've worked with, regardless of what age they are, and as well as people who have sent me messages from across the world over the last few years. This is a topic that comes up a lot, and it's not easy to talk about because people, a lot of people don't want it to have to be a thing. I don't want to have to make sure I pass. I just want to be able to be comfortable in my skin when it comes to my gender identity, and I'm going to do my best, when it comes to matching the insides with the outsides. Wanting to be able to be seen as your true gender identity, that just feels good in and of itself. It means you feel validated, you feel seen, you feel like something is accurate about the way you feel inside and the way people are perceiving you. And like I said, besides that being a reason that people think about how important it might be to them to pass, there's also discomfort that can come from not being seen as their gender identity. People can get misgendered, people can be stared at, or even if it's like curiously people are looking, all the way down to people giving angry looks. Those are things that if you have not actually transitioned yet to see what it's going to be like for you, those are things you can sit and dwell on and wonder, I really don't want that to happen to me. I don't want that to be my experience. I want to transition so I feel better. I don't want to feel worse. And so, once again, it's understandable that this would come up for someone. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's even the safety precaution of being able to pass. And this can depend on where you live, even in the world. There's going to be some places where it's going to be really dangerous if somebody is to see you and think that you're transgender. And again, I hate to say that because there should be no shame in being transgender. And yet it can really come up as a concern for people. Again, depending on where you live, this could be more of a potential in some places than others. And they also can depend on your ethnicity. For, let's say, trans women of color, statistically, that is also a group that tends to be targeted more. I'm not trying to scare you by talking about this. I'm just keeping it real to say this is definitely a concern that comes up for some people. So one thing I want you to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about if you want to transition, and this is later in life, is thinking about the fact that you honestly can't know, as you sit here right now, how much you are going to pass or not pass. Let's say right now when you're watching this, you haven't started hormone therapy, or even if you have, that you haven't started presenting. Again, it's another tricky word to use, but presenting as the gender that you want to be seen as. You can ask your friends, you can ask your therapist, you can look in the mirror, as much as you want, but when it comes down to it, unfortunately, it just has to do with the outside world and what do they think. And that's a big question mark. That's a big what if and a big maybe. I don't know. And the problem, I guess it's more like a catch-22, is that you won't find out until you actually put effort towards it and give it a try. And so, like I said, this is going to look differently for everybody when it comes to how are you going to go about presenting yourself in such a way that you feel like you are going to, some words I've heard people use is be able to just blend in, and for it not to be a big deal. So that is something that you won't be able to know until you actually try it. So keep that in mind, that when it comes to you making your final decision about whether or not you should transition, sure, you're going to look at your different physical attributes, you're going to think about whether or not that's going to, quote, give you away. But when it comes down to it, if you really are in pain and you really need to transition, you're going to do it no matter what. And things such as maybe you feel like you're too tall, maybe you feel like you're too short, things like that are going to somewhat not matter in the end. You're going to find a way to work around it and work through it. Again, that's going to be that situation where you have to weigh out how much pain and discomfort are you in versus what are the risks and challenges that are going to come up from transitioning. I'm going to run through a few specific challenges that I have heard of people who are transitioning later in life when it comes to them thinking about whether or not they are going to be able to pass. And so, first of all, physically, there is a certain amount that your body has changed, probably in the way that you haven't wanted it to change while you were in puberty. And then as you get older, those changes sort of continue to solidify. So it kind of depends on how long it's been that you've been alive and going through this. So again, this can be something that can be a challenge. Let's say, for instance, somebody who was assigned male at birth, but who is actually female. But because they have testosterone, as they get older, their hair starts to thin. And then when they think about transitioning, they're like, my hair, I'm going bald. How's this going to work? They have to then think about, is there a possibility for hair replacement or using certain medications that can help hair grow? Should I get a wig? Is there a certain haircut or hairstyle I can wear? Should I wear scarves? These are questions that the later you are in life, as you think about transitioning, can come up. There's other ways that your body might be developing or have developed that you are like, this is just not going to work. This doesn't look at all like the gender that I feel inside. What's going to happen, like I said, is that especially if you decide to use hormone replacement therapy and letting that take its effects, even for a couple of years at least, to see how much is it going to change, you won't know for sure until you get to that point to see how much does your body change. Financially, that's another concern that comes up for people, is because for some, you may be fortunate enough that you have the funding to be able to pay for instance, surgeries, to be able to help with the way you are presenting yourself physically, or maybe you've saved up money in the hopes that maybe you'd be able to transition one day. Maybe you have really good insurance. So for some people, they don't have those resources. They don't have that ability to know, okay, worst comes to worst, I can just have, such and such surgery, and that's going to help my body look more like the gender I want to be seen as. Another challenge that comes up is, depending on how long you've been alive and how long you have felt like you've been kind of pretending or acting like the gender you were assigned at birth, you're going to have certain mannerisms that you've been doing, certain ways that you walk and talk that aren't consistent with who you really are, and you're going to go through this process of unlearning those and finding what it is that feels true to you when it comes to the way that you are moving about in the world. And that could take some time. There might be things that you do that you're like, oh, it turns out that's really me. I don't need to change that. And there's other things where you might catch yourself, like in the past, it might have been something you forced yourself to do. Maybe you made sure you didn't talk with your hands, because that's what women were told. Women talk with their hands more. Maybe it's something about where the way you carry a bag, do you carry it in front of you, or do you carry it on your side, or you carry it like this? There's all sorts of little things as you pay attention to them that you might notice, oh, this is something that I'm doing that isn't consistent with how I really want to act. That's the way I've been pretending all these years. That can take a while to unlearn. Another challenge to bring up would have to do with maybe if you have any health issues or medical issues, later in life, that you would need to take into consideration if you were thinking about starting hormone therapy or wanting to have surgeries. And so that's something else that can come up as an issue for some people. And lastly, some of you out there have been alive long enough to remember when things were really, really bad for people who are transgender. Again, I have some clients who are in their 60s who they can remember thinking in their early 20s about transitioning. Like, they knew it was something that you could do. Maybe they heard in the news about Christine Jorgensen, who had a sex change operation. And they're like, that's something you can do. That's something I can do. And then just seeing the reaction from society and knowing, I know today it's not perfect, but it is a lot better than it was, let's say, back in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. There are those of you out there who can remember what it was like when this was labeled as something very negative or mentally ill that somebody was going through. Not to say again that that's not happening present day, but it was a lot worse back then. And that could be a stigma that you're still carrying around in yourself that can create a sense of internalized transphobia, where this feeling of being afraid or having negative feelings towards being transgender is something that you felt from the outside, and now you have it inside of you. And that's going to take some time to probably look at. Whereas, do you have shame? Do you have negative judgment against yourself about this? And looking at where did the root of that start? It could have been way back decades ago when you first started learning about what it means to be transgender and having misinformation given to you about that. As I mentioned, it is probably going to take time for you to be able to see how this goes. You're not going to be able to just know it, just sitting and wondering about it and thinking about it. And also, even the first, let's say, few months that you decide to go out into the world and present as your true gender identity, that's going to be different than a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later. Give yourself some compassion and patience as you go about this process. I know it's not easy. It's oftentimes called the in-between stage, where you know that you want to do this, you take the steps to start doing it, and your insides and your outsides do not match up yet. And it can be very frustrating and very difficult, and that's where I want to make sure you do have support in your life to help you get through that, to help encouraging you. Keep keep going, keep letting, for instance, those of you who would take hormone therapy, keep letting the hormones take effect. Keep figuring out your sense of style. Keep figuring out what it is you can do with the way you look and you walk and talk that feels natural to you, but is also matching your insides in terms of how you feel about your gender. And it's going to take time to make that happen. So I'm saying it probably isn't going to be easy at first for some of you. Having to weigh out that risk. How hard is that going to be able to do that or not? I do have some clients who have been thinking about transitioning later in life, and for them, it just isn't worth it to them. They just are like, I just think I'm always going to be seen as the gender I was assigned at birth, not as my true gender identity. They think I'm just going to be seen as a transgender person, not as my gender, my true gender. And again, that's going to be different for each person. I know also some clients who, as they've transitioned, if it turns out that half of the time they pass and half the time they don't, at a certain point they accept that as reality and they say, you know what? All right, so it's not going to go perfect every time. Some of my clients have even turned it into a positive experience where if somebody maybe misgenders them, they take a moment to educate and they say, I'm sorry, but let's say they were misgendered as sir. They would say, actually, I'm a ma'am, and they say it very nicely. They proceed on with the conversation. Sometimes they'll even get into a conversation if the person seems open, like, I'm sorry, what is the right way? I should make sure I don't make that mistake next time. I thinking of a very specific client who has gone about, they actually welcome these conversations when they happen because they know that when that person leaves them, they're like, wow, yeah, that was a transgender person and I always heard about them and I never met one. That's just like a normal person. In fact, that was one of the nicest people I've met all day. I'm saying that you can use that as an example where if as you go through your transition, it turns out that you aren't passing 100% of the time, taking the time to be able to look at that realistically and accept it and find a way to maybe make it into taking it away from being a negative. If you're not able to move it all the way over to a positive, I understand. But at least finding a neutral place in which it's not going to be great when it happens, but finding ways to let it go and be able to move through it. That's what's really going to be important is as you weigh whether or not you should transition because you're worried about whether or not you're going to pass. That question of whether or not you're going to pass, you won't be able to answer that until you actually try and see what it's like. And it's not going to be the same at the beginning as it will be a few years from now. And you might change your mind as to how much it bothers you or not as you go along. All these things I know are not very specific answers to this specific question. So I guess that's my main point is that this is not something that has a simple, straightforward answer. And it's going to take more time to have to not only think through, but then to actually, if you decide to move forward with doing it, giving yourself that, like I said, give yourself time and be patient with yourself and the process and make sure you get support from people who have gone through this as well and ask them, what was this like for you and how did you get through it? That's it for part 2 of transitioning later in life. Be sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you'll know when I create any other new videos in this series or other videos pertaining to similar subjects. Thank you for watching.